the transfer. Like, subscribe, and leave a comment because once you step into this story, there's no turning back. The sirens were already fading when the first body was discovered. It was just before dawn outside a medium-security prison in Northern California, the sky still bruised purple from the night. A corrections officer on his final perimeter walk noticed the ambulance parked at an odd angle near the infirmary entrance. No lights. No urgency. Just stillness. Inside, an inmate lay motionless on a gurney, his face pale, his chest unmoving. There were no visible wounds. No struggle. No explanation that made sense in the moment. By noon, there were 6 more. They came from different cell blocks, different work details, different racial groups, different sentences. The only thing they shared was a recent arrival. All of them had been transferred in from another facility less than 2 weeks earlier. And none of them were supposed to be sick. At first, officials used careful language. Medical complications. Underlying conditions. Out of an abundance of caution. But within 48 hours, the prison was sealed. Lockdowns slammed into place. Guards were ordered to wear masks they'd been reusing for days. Inmates were confined to cells built for 1, now holding 2. The word no one wanted to say was already echoing through the concrete corridors. Coronavirus. What no one understood yet was how fast it had arrived, or how far it would spread. The transfer had seemed routine on paper. 53 inmates moved from a high-capacity facility on the East Coast to relieve overcrowding. A logistical decision signed off by administrators hundreds of miles away, made during a time when prisons were quietly becoming some of the most dangerous places in America. The buses arrived at night. Witnesses later said the men stepped off coughing, exhausted, some barely able to stand. They were processed quickly. No proper testing. No quarantine beyond a brief temperature check that meant nothing to men who'd already learned how to hide weakness. Within days, the virus slipped through the prison like smoke. By the time state investigators arrived, the death toll had climbed into double digits. Families were demanding answers. Guards were calling in sick. Rumors spread faster than official statements, and fear began to do what concrete walls never could. Containment failed. The case landed on the desk of Special Investigator Daniel Mercer on a rainy Tuesday morning. He'd spent 2 decades unraveling corruption, negligence, and quiet disasters hidden behind bureaucratic language. When he read the file, one detail stood out immediately. The transfer should never have happened. Mercer flew in that afternoon. From the outside, the prison looked calm, almost peaceful. Inside, it felt like a war zone that no one was allowed to acknowledge. Inmates banged on cell doors, shouting for medical help. Guards avoided eye contact. The infirmary overflowed, and the morgue was already beyond capacity. The warden met Mercer in his office, hands shaking slightly as he poured coffee neither of them touched. "We followed protocol," the warden said. "We were told it was safe." Mercer didn't respond. He was staring at a transfer manifest pinned to the corkboard behind the desk. Names. Numbers. Dates. One line was circled in red ink. Transfer origin, East River Correctional Facility. Mercer knew that name. East River had reported a surge in respiratory illnesses weeks before the transfer. Not officially. Quietly. Internal memos. Sick call requests. Guard absences. The warning signs were there, buried under pressure to keep facilities running and beds filled. Someone had made a decision, and people were dead because of it. Mercer began interviewing staff. A nurse admitted she'd been told not to document certain symptoms. A transport officer confessed the bus had broken down for hours, inmates packed together, without ventilation. Another guard mentioned an email ordering transfers to continue without delay, even as infection numbers rose. Every answer led back to the same place, a chain of command that stretched far beyond this prison's walls. Then the first witness disappeared. Inmate Marcus Hale had been one of the original transfers. He survived the virus, but barely. From his isolation cell, he'd filed a sworn statement claiming men were already sick before the buses left East River. He named names. He described guards who looked afraid. He said inmates begged not to be moved. Mercer scheduled an interview. Hale never made it. By the time Mercer reached the cell, it was empty. The beds stripped. The walls wiped down. The logbook said Hale had been moved to another facility for medical reasons. No one could say where. That night, Mercer reviewed surveillance footage from the transfer intake. He slowed it frame by frame. Men stumbling. A guard helping one inmate walk. Another inmate collapsing briefly before being pulled upright. Then Mercer saw it. A clipboard in the hands of a transport supervisor. On the top page, stamped in bold letters, was a word that had been officially denied for weeks. Positive. The next morning, another inmate died. This time, the death didn't happen in a cell or the infirmary. It happened during a work detail, in full view of cameras and guards. The man collapsed, gasping, and the footage cut out 30 seconds later due to a technical issue. Mercer requested the raw feed. It was gone. By now, the pattern was undeniable. Evidence was being erased. Witnesses were being moved. And the virus wasn't the only thing spreading. Fear had turned into silence. Mercer contacted federal authorities, pushing for oversight. The response was delayed. Meetings were postponed. Calls went unanswered. Behind closed doors, administrators argued about liability, optics, and timing. Outside, families lit candles. That evening, Mercer received an anonymous message on his phone. No sender. No introduction. Just a photo. It showed the bus depot. Date stamped 3 days before the transfer. Dozens of inmates lined up, coughing, guarded by staff wearing no protective gear. Below the image was a single line of text. They knew before the buses rolled. Mercer stared at the screen, understanding finally settling in. This wasn't negligence. It was a decision. And when he traced the order authorizing the transfer to its source, he realized the truth was far more dangerous than a virus. Because the paperwork led to someone who had everything to lose if the story came out. And when Mercer opened the final encrypted file attached to the message, what he found inside changed the investigation forever. The chain of silence. The name at the top of the file wasn't a warden, a doctor, or a transport supervisor. It was a policymaker. Daniel Mercer read it twice, then a third time, the weight of it pressing into his chest. The authorization for the transfer didn't originate at East River or the receiving prison. It came from a federal emergency coordination office created in the early days of the pandemic, an office designed to move resources fast, bypass red tape, and keep the system from collapsing under pressure. Speed over caution. The file laid out timelines, internal emails, and redacted attachments that told a story no public briefing ever had. East River's medical unit had flagged a surge in respiratory illness 12 days before the transfer. A recommendation to halt movement followed. It was ignored. Another memo warned that testing capacity was insufficient. Ignored again. Then came a final message marked urgent, operational impact, warning that if transfer stopped, overcrowding lawsuits would follow. Someone replied with a single sentence. Proceed as planned. Mercer closed the laptop slowly. This wasn't incompetence. It was a calculated risk taken with human lives as collateral. He returned to the prison the next morning to find it quieter than before. Too quiet. The banging on doors had stopped. Inmates no longer shouted. Guards moved with mechanical precision, avoiding conversation. It felt less like containment and more like compliance. The warden met Mercer at the gate, eyes hollow. They're sending in a federal review team, he said. I was told to cooperate fully. Mercer nodded. He'd heard that line before. Review teams arrived after narratives were shaped, after documents were scrubbed, after blame had been neatly distributed to people who couldn't fight back. Inside the administration wing, Mercer noticed something new on the walls. Freshly posted memos outlining updated health protocols. Masks mandatory. Transfers suspended. Testing expanded. All too late. Mercer requested access to transfer communications between East River and the federal office. The request was denied within minutes. Jurisdictional overlap, they said. Ongoing review. Mercer pushed anyway. He contacted a former colleague, now working in internal oversight. The response came hours later, cautious and coded. Be careful, the message read. People are nervous. That night, Mercer drove to a motel on the edge of town, the kind with flickering lights and doors that didn't quite close right. He spread documents across the bed, mapping timelines, names, and decisions. One pattern stood out. Every critical approval passed through the same advisor. Not a public figure. Not a headline name. Someone who operated behind the scenes, shaping policy, without ever standing at a podium. The kind of person who survived scandals because no one knew where to aim. Mercer was still working when his phone buzzed. A blocked number. "You're looking in the wrong place," a voice said. Calm. Controlled. This was about capacity, not concealment. "Then why erase footage?" Mercer asked. Silence. "Why move a witness?" Mercer pressed. The line went dead. The next morning, Mercer learned that Marcus Hale, the missing inmate, had resurfaced. He was being held in a medical unit at a private facility contracted by the federal government. Officially, Hale was too ill to testify. Unofficially, he was isolated beyond reach. Mercer drove 3 hours to the facility. They denied him entry. "No authorization," the administrator said, rehearsed and polite. "We're under direct instruction." Mercer stood in the parking lot, watching ambulances come and go, wondering how many stories were sealed behind those doors. Then someone slipped him a note. It came folded, passed quickly by a nurse pretending to adjust her badge. Inside was a room number and a time. Mercer waited until shift change. When he reached the room, he found Hale thinner than before, eyes sunken, breath shallow but steady. "They told us it was temporary," Hale whispered. "Said we were safe removing." "Who told you?" Mercer asked. "Everyone," Hale said. "And no one." Hale described East River in the days before the transfer. Men coughing through the night. Medical requests unanswered. Guards masking symptoms to keep shifts staffed. Then the buses arrived. "They didn't test us," Hale said. "They told us to keep quiet." "Why?" Mercer asked. Hale's eyes flicked to the door. "Because if we stayed, someone important would have had to explain why." Before Mercer could ask more, alarms sounded down the hall. Footsteps approached fast. A doctor entered, expression tight. "You need to leave." Mercer stepped back just as security filled the corridor. When he looked again, Hale was already being wheeled away. Mercer never saw him again. Back at his motel, Mercer found his files disturbed. Nothing missing. Just moved. A message. "We're watching." That same night, news broke nationally. Officials announced that inmate transfers during the pandemic were being reevaluated. Statements were issued. Condolences offered. No admissions of fault. Mercer knew the strategy. Delay. Deflect. Let public attention move on. But then a guard from East River went public. She appeared on a late-night news segment, face partially shadowed, voice shaking as she described what she'd seen. Sick inmates loaded onto buses. Orders to look away. Supervisors repeating the same phrase. "We don't have a choice." Within hours, her social media vanished. The video was taken down. The network issued a vague correction. Mercer contacted her the next day. She didn't answer. Instead, he received another anonymous message. This one included a document stamped "Confidential Legal Hold." It detailed internal discussions about acceptable loss thresholds during emergency operations. Mercer felt a chill reading it. Lives had been reduced to numbers. He forwarded the document to multiple outlets, advocacy groups, and oversight committees. He knew the risks. Once released, there was no pulling it back. The response was immediate. Federal agents arrived at the prison. Subpoenas followed. Hearings were scheduled. The advisor's name began circulating quietly among journalists. But so did another rumor, that someone connected to the investigation had tested positive and vanished from public view. Mercer stood alone in the prison parking lot that evening, watching lights flicker on behind barred windows. The system was moving now, but not necessarily toward justice. As he turned to leave, his phone vibrated with a final message. A photo of a sealed bus depot. A fresh date stamp. And beneath it, for words that made his blood run cold. "They're transferring again." The last transfer. The buses rolled before sunrise. Daniel Mercer watched from his car as headlights cut through the fog outside the depot, engines idling low and steady, the sound too calm for what it carried. This time there were fewer inmates, fewer guards, fewer visible mistakes. Everything looked cleaner, controlled,
planned.
He knew now that the system hadn't stopped transferring prisoners during the pandemic. It had simply learned how to do it quietly. Mercer stepped out into the cold air, badge visible, posture steady. Federal oversight had been announced publicly, but enforcement lagged behind the headlines. Paperwork moved slower than buses.
And someone was counting on that.
Inside the depot, inmates stood in marked positions, spaced just enough to look compliant. Masks were issued, not enforced. A supervisor barked orders with the confidence of someone protected by layers of authority. Mercer approached him. "Transfers are suspended," Mercer said. The supervisor didn't flinch. "Emergency exception. Based on what criteria?" The man hesitated. "Just long enough." "Orders," he said finally. Mercer already knew the name behind them. The advisor had resigned quietly 2 days earlier, citing health reasons. No press conference. No questions. A strategic disappearance designed to defuse accountability. But resignation didn't erase emails, signatures, or the consequences left behind. Mercer had spent the night before assembling everything: documents, testimonies, timestamps, and surveillance fragments salvaged before deletion. It formed a clear narrative: outbreaks predicted, warnings ignored, transfers approved to avoid overcrowding litigation and political fallout. Human lives weighed against institutional risk. And lost. Mercer stepped back as the buses began loading. He dialed his phone. This time, someone answered. "I told you to stop," the calm voice said. The same one from weeks earlier. "You told me this was about capacity," Mercer replied. But capacity was never the problem. Silence. "The problem was exposure," Mercer continued. "Not the virus. The blame." "You don't understand the pressure," the voice said. "If the system collapsed." "It did collapse," Mercer cut in. "Just not where the public could see it." The line went dead. Moments later, Mercer's phone buzzed again. Not a call, but an alert. Multiple news outlets had just published the leaked documents. The phrase, "acceptable loss," was already trending. Inside the depot, confusion rippled. Supervisors checked phones. Guards whispered. One of the buses shut off its engine. Then the gates opened. Federal vehicles poured in, lights flashing. Agents moved fast, coordinated, unmistakably prepared. Someone had finally decided the cost of silence was higher than the cost of truth. Transfers were halted on the spot. The supervisor was detained. Logs were seized. Phones confiscated. The buses never left the depot. Within hours, the story dominated every major network. Congressional hearings were announced. Families of the dead were named. The advisor's resignation turned into a subpoena. Questions spread outward, from prisons to detention centers to the emergency offices created during the crisis. The narrative had shifted. But justice didn't come cleanly. Weeks later, Mercer sat in a quiet courtroom as testimony unfolded. Administrators blamed guidelines. Guidelines blamed emergency powers. Emergency powers blamed unprecedented circumstances. Everyone accepted responsibility in theory. No one accepted it personally. Charges were filed, limited, careful, technical. A few careers ended. A few settlements were reached. Policy reforms were promised. Lives were not restored. Marcus Hale's name appeared once in the proceedings, listed as deceased due to complications. No cause specified. No cross-examination allowed. The guard who had spoken out never returned to public view. Mercer stood outside the courthouse afterward, listening to reporters debate accountability in measured tones. The system had done what it always did: absorbed impact, redistributed blame, and moved forward. But something had changed. In the months that followed, independent oversight became mandatory for prison transfers. Emergency powers were narrowed. Testing protocols were enforced. The quiet movement of human beings like cargo became harder to justify, harder to hide. Mercer returned to his office, the walls bare except for one photograph he kept pinned above his desk. It showed a prison bus at dawn, doors open, no one inside. An image of what should have been. Sometimes, late at night, He reread the final report. The language was careful, sanitized, legal. But between the lines lived the truth. That danger didn't always wear a mask or carry a weapon. Sometimes it arrived on a schedule. Sometimes it came with signatures. And sometimes the most devastating crimes weren't committed in the shadows, but in plain sight, disguised as procedure. The public moved on, as it always did. New stories replaced old ones. Crises overlapped. Memory faded. But Mercer knew one thing would linger. Every time a bus engine started near a prison, someone would ask the question that hadn't been asked soon enough before. And somewhere, a decision-maker would hesitate. Because once the truth escaped containment, it never fully went back inside. If you think this story was intense, you're not ready for the next one. Subscribe now to enjoy more of it.